Welcome to the Faith Informing Podcast, the podcast that talks about what informs our faith and how our faith forms us. My name is Travis Jameson, and I'm your host. This podcast is a ministry of the Palo Alto Christian Reformed Church, where I serve as pastor here in Palo Alto, California. I'm thrilled to be able to share this conversation I had with Thomas Lynch with all of you. Thomas is a man of profound wisdom, hilarious comedy, and incredible poetry. In our conversation, we talk about soul-shaping moments in his life, how he navigates death and grief, as well as his own story of becoming a poet while working as a funeral director. Stay tuned for another great episode. Thomas Lynch is a lifetime funeral director in Michigan. He's also a writer. He's written essays, poetry, fiction, and he is a joy to read. I first came across his writing while I was in seminary. I was given a book called The Undertaking to read as a seminary student. And I thought, well, this is a bit of a strange book. It's called The Undertaking, Life Studies from the Dismal Trade. And it's written by a guy who's a funeral director. And I thought, that seems like an odd book to get in seminary. But as I read it, I found it to fill my soul as I realized that Thomas Lynch knows what it's like to be near people who are dying, to care for those who are grieving, and to walk with people in some of the most difficult times of life. And I so resonated with that as a pastor. And so I'm so grateful that he's on the show today. His writing has been featured in all kinds of places like The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Yorker, all the big magazines. And I'm so grateful that he's here. He lives right now in northern Michigan, but he also has a home in Ireland, which is an ancestral cottage. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So Thomas, thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks for your interest, Travis. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So you write in the introduction to your poem, your book of poetry called Bone Rosary, you write, "How do we come to be the ones we are is a question that I've been long beleaguered by." And I love that question. I often start this podcast with guests by asking them to tell a bit about themselves. And the way I frame that question is, um, can you tell us the persons, places, and things that have affected you, that have been meaningful for getting you to where you are today? And yet you have this question, how do we come to be the ones we are, which is, I think, a similar question. So why don't we start with that? Can you tell us a bit about who you are? Who is Thomas Lynch? What are some significant moments in your life that got you to where you are today?
Well, I think, Travis, that and thanks for starting with that question because I like. I mean, it's a lifelong curiosity of mine.
Mm,
Literally, how do we arrive at where we are on any given day? And I often I'm introduced a lot at conventions and conferences and readings and stuff like that. And I always feel like I should sort of amend the introduction by saying that I was raised in a culture of Irish Catholics in which the men were expected to grow up to become either priests or alcoholics. And 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 my name is Tom, and I'm not a priest. However, I was named for a priest, and I find in some ways this dead priest, my father's uncle, uh, who was Thomas Patrick Lynch. He died very young. In the He was out in Taos, New Mexico, and he had survived the pandemic at the turn of the 20th century, the Spanish flu.
mm-hmm.
He had survived that, and his mother had convinced him that he had been saved from that by God, and because of that, God had some purpose for him beyond, and that's, I think, led to his so-called vocation. He was called to the priesthood by this uh, by this happenstance. In any event, he became a priest, and they shipped him. He was with the Archdiocese of Detroit, and but they shipped him out to New Mexico to work with the indigenous population there, and they thought that the high, dry air of the Blood of Christ mountains would keep him from pneumonia and all the other respiratory illnesses associated with that Spanish flu outbreak, in much the same way that COVID uh, compromises our respiratory systems now. And so he lived for about 2 years, and then got pneumonia and died, and was
Mm.
brought down the mountains and shipped home to Detroit, um, where my father, who was at that time about 10 years old, um, maybe 12 years old, snuck in. He was with my grandfather when they went to make the funeral arrangements at the funeral home in Jackson, Michigan. And my father roamed around the building while the older men were making the arrangements for limousines and boxes and mum plants and honoraria. And my father found the room where the body was being dressed in his priestly vestments by two men who eventually lifted the body up and rolled the body towards them, and sidestepping their way, made their way over to a coffin and lay the priest in it. And it
Mm.
was for that moment in 1936, in August, that my father traced his intention to become a funeral director.
Mm.
And him being a funeral director played itself out in the fact that of his 9 children, um, all but I think two are involved in the funeral home, one of the funeral homes in one way or another. And now a third generation is pretty much taking care of the funeral homes. I think there are 8 or 9 of them now that bear our parents' names. And and I think that was probably that moment when the priest was being elevated and lifted and carried and placed into his coffin. I think that was one of those watershed events that shaped the family happenstance for a couple, well, at least two more generations. Well, 3 generations, including my father. So I think that was it. And of course, when I was, I think 6 years old, maybe 7, I was sent off to learn Latin, enough Latin to become an altar boy. And the priest teaching me was a priest who had gone to seminary with my dead uncle, my dead great uncle,
Mhm.
Father Kenny, who had, I believe, conspired with my mother to make me into a priest, to serve out the vocation that the poor dead priest never got a chance to do for very
Mhm.
long. There were some deal breakers for Catholic priests, one of which was the whole notion of celibacy, which by the time I got to be, you know, of a certain age, I knew I couldn't do that. And so I went into funeral service instead, and I remember saying to my father once when he was recounting this story about seeing the priest being vested and lifted into a coffin, I said, "Well, Eddie," we used to call him Eddie, "Eddie, why didn't you want to be a priest?" And he said, "Well, the priest was dead." He was not much given to metaphor, but he could see things as they were.
Not much of an inspiration there.
Yeah, there were 3 people in the room. The priest was dead. The other 2 were, doing the heavy lifting, but they were still alive, and so he decided he'd do that. And
Still alive and still getting paid.
still getting paid, and still could be in love with Rosemary O'Hara, who he'd met
Mm.
that same year in the 5th grade at St. Francis de Sales. So, and he
So
married her.
your parents met in the 5th grade?
That's right. Yeah.
Wow, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. And then he went off to war when they were in high school. And she wrote him every day during the war, and he wrote her back. I have the letters he sent back. Her letters, of course, are somewhere in the South Pacific and,
Mhm,
on Cape Gloucester or Pavuvu or one of those, Okinawa or someplace. But
mhm.
correspondence between them lasted long enough for him to get home, and they started making babies almost immediately. And they are my siblings. And thanks be to God, they're all alive and well. And
Wow.
yeah,
That's an amazing story. Um, that image of the priest being your great uncle being lifted up in his vestments and put in the coffin is, um, I don't know. There's a lot that could be said about just that image because that is so potent. It almost brings tears to my eyes just thinking about it. It's a
when you
powerful
think of
image.
it, Travis, Catholic boys of my father's generation would have gone to daily mass. And one of the things they're taught to do is to ring the bell if you're an altar boy at the elevation when the body of Christ, represented by the host, the bread, the unleavened
Mhm.
bread, lifted over the priest's head at the altar.
Oh,
And
wow.
that to me, uh, it doesn't take much to think that my father thought that two men in white shirts and striped ties and pinstripe pants lifting a body of a dead priest vested in the liturgical vestments. I think it's close enough,
Mhm.
because the
Right.
elevation is the lifting of, the dead rabbi into the air, uh, who's alive again in our faith.
Well, I know as a poet, you play with metaphors all the time. So, is there would is that have you used that metaphor before, like the funeral director as priest?
No, but I do think there is something lately, Travis. I think it's because of my age, and because I've stopped directing funerals. I leave that. I live up north, and all I do is read and type
Mm.
and feed an old dog who is the only mammal of any size that can live with me. And um, for some reason, I've taken up obituary writing and eulogies. Friends know I'm not going to come down and wear a tie and swing the door anymore, but they asked me to write obituaries and give eulogies. And and I've often said, as a part of a eulogy, that there is something priestly about, uh, at least the friends I have. There's something priestly about them, that there, a lot of them are writers, and I think there's
Mm.
something about wanting to leave a record of having been here that has some there's something um, holy about that,
Mhm.
and priestly in the way that the text becomes like the word, a way of making our lives an open book, our having it. It's sort of a witness of our having been here. So I don't know. I This past month I buried the first living poet I ever met, who was my mentor and dear friend Michael Heffernan.
Mm.
And I remember thinking that, I mean, he was schooled by Jesuits, and while he was occasionally apostate and devoutly lapsed, much as I am, there was something about the metaphors, the religious metaphors associated with, the church, that we can't outrun.
Mm.
They they are still there, and yeah.
Yeah.
So I find that there's a class of of believers and disbelievers. It's like this joke they tell in Belfast where they've had such religious strife there for so many years. They'll say, "Are you a
Mhm.
Catholic or a Protestant?" You'll say, "Well, I'm an atheist." They say, "Yes, but are you a Catholic or a Protestant atheist?"
I like
Because,
that.
because we can't outrun this imprint of what is essentially the most uh, some of the deepest metaphors and symbols we'll ever have are given to us religiously.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Yeah, I always like this, I like to say that, like, religion is not just beliefs, but it's culture. It
yeah,
affects us so deeply that regardless of what you believe as an adult, your religious upbringing has such a significant effect on you.
yeah. Whether
Mhm.
I believe or disbelieve, I do it
Yeah,
as a Catholic, however lapsed I may be. You know,
yeah, yeah. So going back to the eulogy and obituary writing, what how do you go about that? Like, when you are taking on a friend's obituary, like, do you have a certain way that you would frame an obituary? What makes a good obituary?
hard to know, really. I know them when I see them.
Mm,
And once I wrote a sentence. I don't know what book it's in, but I said that mourning is a romance in reverse. That it's like learning to let go, where romance is learning to hold on.
mm,
And but the impulse is much the same. It's so focused on an other, you know. And I think obituary. What do they say about journalism is the first draft of history? Well, obituary is the first draft of biography, and I try to keep that in
mm,
mind. That um, Jim Harrison, another Michigan writer, the bed of heaven to him, uh, said that death takes everything but our stories. And he's right about that. So it's very important as an obituarist to get the story right, because if you don't, you leave it to somebody else and they may not get it right, you know, or they may make it up. And people will see that it doesn't ring true. And this is particularly the case. We tend to idolize the dead because we're driven by a sense that we can make it up to them now, or we need to, fix or repair a relationship that might have been damaged by just living. And so we, you know, there's a lot of puffing up. And what we want in an obituary is the real person. And so I find that the closer to the incarnation itself, the better off I am.
mm. Yeah,
But
that we can make the dead be either saints or devils often. They're either like the incarnation of evil or incarnation of holiness. But yeah, when you read the story of someone and it rings true, it's something that's really a gift, I think. A real gift to people.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it helps when they're writers because they leave a paper trail. So in the case of my friend Michael Heffernan, who died on the 3rd of May after suffering, 5 years of dementia, which would make you think whomever's in charge here is a practical joker. The man with an IQ somewhere between 180 and 200 who could quote whole passages of Joycean fiction and Yeatsian poetry and endless Frost poems, would become confused about reality.
Mm.
That's the kind of practical joke that only God would perform, whoever she is. You know.
Yeah, that's I used to serve as a chaplain in a retirement community for 5 years while I lived in Michigan, and I spent a lot of time in the dementia care unit. And yeah, I saw a lot of incredibly intelligent, successful, powerful people brought to, you know, uh, humiliating circumstances at times.
Befuddlement. Yeah. Mhm.
And and strangely, at times, moments of great peace and moments of great joy. Um, it was a really interesting place to serve because um, you couldn't expect from the individual with dementia to be who you've heard them to be. You could only accept them as they were right then in that moment.
Yes.
And for me, it was a real practice in like just being present and non-judgmental and being like, this is this person right here, right now. Uh, and yeah, so dementia, yeah, I think that, yeah, it's just such it's both sad, difficult, frustrating, and profound in the experience of it all. Yeah.
I remember a woman whose father was dying of dementia who came to the funeral home to sort of prearrange her father's obsequies, whatever they might be. And he was going to live for months yet to come, but she wanted to do this while she felt able to do it. She came in and we spent a couple hours just chatting about exactly what you just said about how do you meet a person exactly where they are when where they are is altogether different from where they've been all
Hmm.
your. And she said, my father was always and this man had been a financial whiz. He'd been an investment banker, very powerful in his own circle of friends and professional associates. And she said, um, there was always a distance between us because his mind was always elsewhere on the interest rate and the
Mm,
return on investments and things that I didn't know anything about because I was a little girl growing up. And she said when I started dating, he never approved of the men who came to call because they were never good enough and never tall enough or never rich enough or never. And she said, and I had my own rules for them, but he had harder rules for them. And she says, and now it's so hard to see this very, very vibrant, intelligent man who was also fairly controlling and fairly disapproving. She says, he doesn't know me now, Tom, but he approves.
mm,
And
hmm,
I thought,
that's
it
incredible.
struck me as the kind of miracle, the kind of backhanded miracle that the book of Job is full of.
Hmm.
Where were you when
Yeah,
the world?
it reminds me of a story of my time when I was at that retirement home. There was a fellow that came in, a patient, and he had three daughters and one son. His kids just thought he was a jerk. I mean, and he was. I got to know him, got to know his history. Man, I would not have wanted to be his friend throughout his
Yeah,
life. But then he was there for 2, 3 years, and he softened. The sicker he got, the softer he got. And by the end of it, especially 2 of his daughters, said they told me, I remember when I did it, when I was preparing to do his funeral, um, they told me, like, they had never had a relationship with their dad like they did in those last 2 years. It was the best season of their life with him. And, so I was when I did the funeral, there was still a room full of people that thought he was a jerk, but his 2 daughters knew him in his weakest moments and found out he could love. And it was just stunning, absolutely stunning.
yeah. As his body and mind wore down, his spirit was just working up.
Yeah, exactly, that's right. Well, um, now that we're on the topic of death, could I get you to read a poem for us?
Sure.
I think it would be a shame to not have you on and not have you read a poem. I was sharing before we started recording your uh, poems in the Bone Rosary book. I've been reading through, and there's so much depth to them, so much humor that I found them. I find them just beautiful to read. But I came across this one. It's called A Death, and this one doesn't necessarily have the humor per se of other poems, but I think it brings a lot of the depth of what you're working on. And so, could you read that for us?
I will. I just want to preface it by saying
Sure.
you've gotten to the first poem I ever published in a journal. Uh,
Mm.
I I had sent this poem to John Nims, a Michigan man who was editor of Poetry Magazine, which was the where I mean that was the best magazine to publish in when I was starting to write poems. And so I sent this poem and a couple others, and he wrote back and said, "Mr. Lynch, is this your style?" He said, you may punctuate correctly or not at all, but nowhere in between." And he said, "If you'd like to have another go at punctuation, I'll have another look at these poems."
Hmm.
And that night, I called my friend Michael Heffernan, my English professor, my poet friend, and said, "Could you punctuate these for me?" Which he did right away. And I sent him back, and John Nims took it, and I became immediately a published poet, albeit an internationally unknown published poet, but nonetheless a poet.
That's a
This is
great
called
example. It takes even a village to write poetry
it sure
sometimes.
does. This is called a death. In the end, you want the clean dimensions of it mentioned, to know the thing adverbially, while asleep, after long illness, tragically in a blaze, as you would the word of any local weather, where it gathered, when it got here, how it kept the traffic at a standstill, slowed the pace, closed the terminals. Lineage and issue, names and dates, the facts you gain most confidence in facing, histories and habitats and whereabouts. Speak of it, if you speak of it at all, in parts, the CVA or insufficiency or growth that grew indifferent to prayer and medication. Better a tidy science for a heart that stops than the round and witless horror of someone who, one dry night in perfect humor, ceases measurably to be.
Thank you. Can you say a few words about this poem?
My um, a classmate of mine, Anne Callahan, died of a brain tumor when we were both in our 30s.
Mm.
Her sister, Anne Callahan, was one of 18 children by the same parents. So
Was
it
she
was,
also Irish Catholic?
well, Callahan, yeah. Her
Yeah.
her her mother was O'Brien, her father was Callahan. What's more, Travis, her father was a church organist. So he was sort of a modern day Bach
Mm.
with all these children. And we used to say to Mrs. Callahan, "You must really love children." And she'd say, "I really love Jack Callahan."
Can't get enough of them.
Speaking for a generation of Catholic women for whom enough was never enough. Yeah. And anyway, when Anne died, I thought, what are you going to, and I remember looking, I had to get her death certificate signed. And it was, yeah, it all had to do with the tumor. And I thought, yeah, it's nice to have science for this because Anne ceasing to be is more than anyone could take.
Mm.
And but she triggered something that she triggered enough that day for me that I got this poem out of it. And once I was encouraged by its publication, I thought, well, I won't stop now. I just kept writing poems. So
Mm.
mm.
Had you always been interested in poetry? Like, had you been writing a long time? Just
I'd read a lot of poetry, Travis, and I
okay.
think I think this is the important thing. Writers are nothing but readers who kind of go karaoke. They think I could do that. And so I admired the poetry that well, I wanted to have been the one who wrote, when you are old and gray and full of sleep and nodding by the fire and on and on. I loved the sound it made, the language and the meter of it. I just loved it. It sounded like my own heart beating when I was walking.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I always read poetry, and I think committing poetry just naturally follows.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I've been fortunate with that.
Yeah, this poem here, it actually for me when I read it and I've thought about it, it reminds me of something I did as a kid with my siblings, which was we would ask each other, I don't know why we asked this, but we'd ask, "How do you wanna die?"
Yeah.
And you get it was always like, "Oh, I don't wanna drown," I don't wanna go out that way. And we would talk about this, and over the years of being a pastor, I've heard many people talk about, they wanna die peacefully while asleep after a long illness, like they don't want, uh they don't wanna die, as you say in that last line, "one dry night in perfect humor." Like, it's like, um and I
That's existential death. You know,
yeah,
when there's not an easy cause, when you can't say they got killed in a car accident or they had a heart attack. When it's just they went to bed and didn't wake up. That's too cute by half, we think.
yeah, right, right.
It's
Yeah,
not open speculation, but you're right, it's usually children who do it. Although
yeah.
lately I heard one of the presidential candidates talking about whether he wanted to be electrocuted in a boat or eaten by a shark, and I thought, "Huh,
That sounds about right. Oh, man. So, you say, you write in one place, you say, "Language connects us to one another.
yeah,
Possibly it was this awareness that made me write as if someone might be listening to the words I was placing on the page."
hmm."
Um, and I
Yeah,
love that because I think the best writers are writers that are writing expecting to be heard. Um, but there's yeah, what were you getting at with this?
well, I think I've always had, in a sense, an ideal reader, someone I
Mm,
thought will get this if I write it correctly. And the other thing that I find useful as a writer is, and I've told this to writing students, the thing you fear the most will hunt you down. So write about what you fear the most. Now, that line about the thing you fear the most will hunt you down, I heard standing at the back of a Lutheran church while a father was trying to give a eulogy for his dead daughter.
mm,
Said, the thing you fear the most will hunt you down. Now, I counted the syllables, there are 10, and they're almost perfect iambics. Da-dum, 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 da-dum. The thing you fear the most will hunt you down. It's like it's very much like prayer and very much like poetry.
mm,
And so I've often said, if you're scared or frightened, write it. Find a sentence to contain it, because if you can write it, I wrote a sentence and it's now in a book. My daughter, my daughter jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge. My daughter jumped to her death from the Golden Gate Bridge,
mm,
which is true. That happened. And it's a terrible, terrible truth, and certainly another watershed in our family's existence. But when I wrote that and the sky didn't fall directly on me, I thought there's almost a consolation in being able to say it in words.
mm.
Now, I don't know how that works, but that it works, I can't deny.
Yeah, there's something powerful in it's like being willing to when we're willing to I don't wanna say confront because that seems too strong of a word,
The
but
right word, though. That's
just
good.
yeah, open the door a crack even
Yeah,
to the thing that scares us the most.
worst thing that
Um,
can happen.
yeah, it is, it's amazing what we're able to continue to live with.
Well, that's been my line of work for most of my life is meeting with families for whom the worst that can happen has happened.
Mm,
And I see
yeah,
them standing upright and speaking to one another, and they're still dispensing kindnesses sometimes. There's bitterness, there's rancor, there's, sarcasm. There's a fist they always shake in the face of a God that they don't quite believe in like they did the day before.
mhm,
But still, they're upright in speaking in sentences, which proves to me that whomever's in charge here, it's not Tom, and I can rely on whoever it is,
yeah,
whatever, and it's not Tom. And that's to me the only article of faith that still works. If there's a God, it's not me. But I'm upright in speaking in sentences, and people to whom the worst that can happen, including myself, are still upright in speaking in sentences.
yeah,
I don't know if that's faith or just, playing the odds
mm.
or Pascal's gambit, I'm not sure. It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, I gotta, um, when you mentioned that your daughter jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge, I'm here in Palo Alto, which is about an hour's drive from the Golden Gate Bridge. And um, I was reading a little bit about that, but that happened in 2020. And yeah, did you feel like by seeing so many people experience the worst thing they could imagine, um, did that give you any solace or comfort in the weeks that followed, or was it a whole new journey for you at that moment?
Yeah, I'd say the latter, probably. I'd
Mm,
say I do know, Travis, that this wasn't an isolated event. My daughter's struggle with mental illness didn't just happen. It had
mm,
been ongoing for many years and included an estrangement from her family of origin, myself, her mother, her brothers, that almost prepared us in some ways for this final fatal symptom in
mm,
much the same way as the myocardial infarction that may kill me someday will not be an isolated event. It's related to the indolence and the sedentary trade and the cheeseburgers with the ketchup on them and the French fry. All of it's related, and then there's a
mm,
symptom. And my daughter's um, whatever affliction got her to that bridge and put her off that bridge. That affliction wasn't an isolated moment. That moment was one of a kind, but it was part of it was like all of us, we're one of a kind.
mhm,
And yeah, we have a cloud of witnesses and ancestors.
mm, mm. Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
I Yeah, family death is so there's something about as a pastor, I've seen lots of death. I've been by the bedside with strangers even. And and I've had these profound moments when I'm with a stranger or someone I just know a little bit. Um, but when it was my mother-in-law, it was a totally different story. A completely different experience. And all of a sudden, I realized I needed all of these people in my life that I didn't know I needed, like the
Yeah.
chaplain at the hospital or um, the. I remember my mother in law died, and then we were trying to get the funeral plans together, and this church she had gone to for 20 years just got a brand new pastor in who didn't know her, you know, who he didn't. I think this was his first funeral at the church. He was a young guy, and boy, I'll never forget him now. He did such an amazing job with us, even though he didn't know us from Joe down the street. Uh, Yeah, so it's a different experience when you go through it yourself, that's for sure.
I have found that gratitude is a lighter lift than grievance. And by
Mm,
grievance, I don't mean grief. Grief is as normal as, every other feeling we
yeah.
experience. But grievance, that tendency to whinge and moan and, you know, uh, think a bunch of old white guys sitting around having coffee. The world has been, tilted in their to their advantage for most of history, for all of history.
Mhm, mhm,
And yet they don't know it and they won't admit to it. But every once in a while, you'll meet somebody who has learned to live life on life's terms, whatever they may be, and they end up more grateful than aggrieved.
mm,
And gratitude, I think, has the same etymology as the word for grace.
mm,
Yeah, I know it's the same as gratis, which is free.
yeah,
Ah, so I just find, as with my daughter, who was 45 when she took her life, I don't think I have another 45 years in my life. So whatever else the math of it is, I was so grateful for the 45 years of Heather Grace I got, and I don't think I'll have 45 years of bereavement to offset that. So
mm,
the net of my experience of my dear departed daughter is gratitude. And
mhm,
gratitude makes it easier to get up in the day and to, live life on life's terms, which include um, the living and the dead.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, you wrote a whole, book of poetry in honor of your daughter, right?
Well, I just stole her name to use for the title. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
from
I wrote a poem
Skating
called
with Heather Grace.
Someday
Yeah,
I think my love will seem entirely deficient.
mm,
It is. It turns out to have been prophetic, but as poetry is,
mm,
I think poetry, like other forms of art, and certainly like most prayer and authentic religious experience, knows us better than we know ourselves. And
mhm,
so if we find a way to access the source of that art or prayer or poetry, then we are we are dealing in a reality that's beyond our senses. And it gifts us with sort of prescient visions. We see things in a way that we don't see things ordinarily. And
mm,
that's why I keep doing it. And I don't know how it works, but that it works, I do know it does work for me because um, it just does. And sometimes I when I read poems, they seem strange to me now, but I can still remember the day I wrote them and what was going on in my head and my heart. So,
mhm. Yeah, I was actually wondering about that before we came on together. Because in the attempt at writing that I've done throughout my life, sometimes after I get something published, I can forget about it. Like, it's in the sense of, like, I wrote it in the moment, it meant so much, but then it gets sent off, it gets published, it's done, kind of from my vantage point. And sometimes I kind of forget that, "Oh, what was I think?" So you find that when you come back to these poems that you might have written 30 years ago, it brings you back?
immediately, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah, and other times I look at them and say, "Boy, the guy who wrote that was really onto something." As if as if as if it wasn't me, you know?
Yeah, right.
There
You're like,
there's
"Ah."
there's this estrangement, you know? And yet if I read it out loud, like reading that poem you asked me to today, I can remember every little trope, all the
Mm,
word choices, all the, yeah, it feels like a gift, you know?
yeah,
And,
yeah.
thanks is the thing I say.
Well, we're running up on our time here. Why don't we finish our time together with another poem from you. Would that be
I
okay?
read a Could I read a poem by my friend Heffernan?
Absolutely. That would be wonderful. So
This
what's
is
his Michael
this is
Heffernan?
Michael Heffernan. This is a book called Love's Answer. He wrote this about halfway through his career,
Great.
and um, this is his widow asked me to pick out a poem that represented his for the memorial folder that they used at his funeral.
Mm,
So here's the poem. It's called Merciless Beauty.
mm,
And like everything, it just starts in the neighborhood. He grew up in Southwest Detroit down by Verner and Junction, you know? And yeah, Merciless Beauty by Michael Heffernan. Look to the blue above the neighborhood, and nothing there gives any help at all. We have seen the fuchsia, and it doesn't work. Time flows away. The mystery it fills with our undoing moves aside a while and brings a new reality into play, apparently. And here's the main idea. The wind of time appears to blow through here, the periwinkle and mayapple, trembling in wind that is of their own kind, a gorgeous color of a clarity that fills our eyes with brightness to see through, for all the good it does us, and to tell the morning glory from the glory of God.
mm,
I just never tire of his poems, and he's like me. He spent enough time in Ireland to know that something very holy happens to some of us when we go there. It
mm.
feels like home, even though we've never been, you know. And yeah, he has a poem about boiling Aquinas's body down to bones. It's really good. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to pick that up. I love that. That is
Yeah,
good.
this will return anybody who reads Michael Heffernan poems. It'll return any time you spend with them, and they're in the library. So go and
Yeah,
ask. And if
I'll go
not, go
find
and
it.
read them. Yeah, yeah.
Well, Thomas, thank you so much for being on the show today, and I've just so enjoyed this conversation. I wish we could talk all day. This is fantastic.
You're going to get over that impulse, Travis. But thank you. It was very.
All right, thank you so much.
Bye bye.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Faith Informing Podcast. Thomas and I talked about some difficult topics today, including death and suicide. Be sure to take good care of yourself as you process this episode and continue to wrestle with your own history of loss. My prayer for you today is that you may know God's nearness in the midst of your grief. May He be your comfort during the most difficult times of life. The God we serve is the God who knows the pain of loss. He knows it personally and intimately in His Son, Jesus Christ. So until our next episode, take good care.